Suffering for the Lord in these chairs. Okay, so Unit 6.0, page 32. I want to take a little bit of a look here. And did some of you, any of you, a few of you, read The Courage to Teach? Not yet. Those of you that are doing this for credit, this was what you were supposed to have read for today, but I won't dwell on that. So it's a really good book, and I want to just give you a little snapshot of Parker Palmer, a couple of ideas that he has. This will tantalize you into reading more, and particularly what I want to talk about is the question of the center, teacher-centered, student-centered, and subject-centered approaches. Okay? This is what he's really raising. It's a sort of more theoretical frame around education, and it's actually very useful. It becomes very practical in a lot of ways. So I've drawn the three up here. Sort of what's really at the center. What's our model? This is about models and approaches. So what Parker Palmer is going to say about this is traditional education, and especially formal education, has usually geared around a teacher-centered model. The teacher is the expert. The teacher delivers the content. This is very much the sort of open up the head, pour in the content, close that up again, with no scarring or anything. Yes, it looks very nicely. I know it's a fairly shocking thought that I just opened your head right up there, but that's kind of the teacher-centered model. So the way that plays itself out is the teacher sets the agenda, the teacher delivers the content. It's very much the teacher at the center of the enterprise. Even the way that the space is set up would have the teacher at the center of the enterprise, right? And so what he's saying is that there's basically what he wants to say about these is there's certainly strength in that model, and the expertise of a content expert who delivers that content and their expertise and that content at the center of things has value. It has rigor, it has substance, and there's a lot of value in all of that. Right? The problem is it becomes very contingent upon the quality of that instructor, and it can be very monological rather than dialogical, leads to passivity rather than activity. And then in response to which, particularly in the last few decades, there's been a kind of reaction against some of the limitations of this teacher-centeredness to a student-centeredness. Right? So the student-centeredness is taking more seriously who the learner is, what qualities they have, what they bring to the learning. It's more interactive and more geared around the needs or concerns or values of the student. And so there's strength also in a more student-oriented approach. The problem around that, according to Palmer and many others, is that it unfortunately is susceptible to a certain kind of subjectivism. If the student is at the center of things, you kind of just go along with the needs or desires of the student, and you kind of play to what they're all about. And it can even play to a kind of entertainment model, basically, although no one who is a proponent of this would ever call it that. But it can sort of say, well, back to the satisfying the customer, plays into a certain kind of consumerism. Right? So what Palmer says is really, in a sense, he's trying to say that the best of both of those models, and trying to avoid the worst of them. I think that's machinery outside. Could be just very large insects. Here in the tropics, there's amazing things that we don't have in the temperate rainforest of British Columbia. So I'm thinking they might be giant insects or just someone doing a kind of weed whacker thing, right? Is that grass cutting? Okay, there we go. Good. So back to Parker Palmer. What he's trying to say is his model that he advocates, and this is chapter 5 of the book where he spells this out, is subject-centered is better than teacher-centered or learner-centered. Right? So learning-centered is really what he's trying to say. He calls this subject-centered. Others will call it learning-centered, right? Rather than student-centered. And what Palmer means by that is, I'll give you a few quotes from this to illustrate it, is in a sense, his language is setting the subject matter at the heart of the conversation, making that the center of things, and then taking, in a sense, both the teacher and the learner and surrounding them and having them always interrogate the great thing that is put at the center of their conversation, the great thing that is the center of their learning. So for us, I said the way that I usually draw this sort of from the way that I organize my classes is sort of everybody gathered around the great thing, which is learning. This class is about learning. What is learning? How does learning happen? How can learning be maximized? I try to take something like a learning-centered, subject-centered approach, right? So what Palmer is saying is the goal is to set that great thing in the center. Here's what he says. Perhaps there are clues to a synthesis between the teacher-centered and the student-centered, in the image of a community of truth where the subject sits in the middle and knows. Okay, the subject matter, the topic, whatever it is. Could be discipleship, could be marketing, it could be cancer, it could be sharks, so whatever it is you want to learn about, right? The subject sits at the center and knows. Perhaps the classroom should be neither teacher-centered nor student-centered, but subject-centered, modeled on the community of truth. This is a classroom in which teacher and student alike are focused on a great thing, a classroom in which the best features of teacher and student-centered education are merged and transcended by putting not teacher, not student, but subject at the center of our attention. We want a community of truth in the classroom. This is one of his very powerful ideas, a community of truth. A bunch of people that are commonly pursuing truth. A community that can keep us honest, we must put a third thing, a great thing, at the center of the pedagogical circle. When student and teacher are the only active agents, community slips into narcissism, where neither the teacher reigns supreme nor the students can do no wrong. A learning community that embodies both rigor and involvement, right? But for him, rigor is the great advantage here, and involvement is the great advantage there, right? A community that involves both rigor and engagement and involvement will elude us until we establish a plumb line that measures teacher and students alike as great things do. In other words, let that great thing speak for itself. Pursue it. Right? Give it, in a sense, its own moment in the sun, and everybody gathers around it and interrogates what it is. The subject-centered classroom is characterized by the fact that the third thing, not teacher, not student, but the subject, the third thing, has a presence so real, so vivid, so vocal that it can hold the teacher and student alike accountable for what they say and what they do. The great thing is so alive that the teacher can turn to the student or the student to the teacher, and neither can make a claim on the other, and either can make a claim on the other in the name of that great thing. Okay. In the subject-centered classroom, the teacher's task is to give that great thing an independent voice, a capacity to speak its truth quite apart from the teacher's voice in terms that students can hear and understand. Right? So, he goes on to say, among other things, passion for the subject propels that subject, not teacher, into the center of the learning circle. And when a great thing is in the midst, students have direct access to the energy of learning and of life. Right? So he's trying to bring together rigor and involvement with a focus outside of yourself on that great thing that is being interrogated, right? So it keeps that subject always at the center of things. That's where the energy goes, answering the questions about that subject. What is it, right? Not dominated by the teacher, not dominated by the student, but by a common pursuit in what he calls a community of truth to get at knowledge of that thing, right? Whatever that thing is, the great thing that has been put at the center of stuff. I think there's a lot actually to that. It avoids the problems of domination by the teacher to the silencing and exclusion of the student. It avoids the problem of subjectivism or relativism at its best. This is what he's trying to do. Yeah. A very interesting idea, worth teasing out. It's hard to summarize all of what's in that very quickly, but that's the idea. So this has very practical kind of, in a sense, implications, right, for whatever kind of teaching you think of yourselves as doing. So do you think of yourself as the teacher as the center and your content and your expertise being actually the focal point of everything? right? Do you think of the students and them and who they are being the focal point of everything? Do you think of the two of you together gathering around a great thing and interrogating that great thing, studying that great thing, getting to the bottom of that great thing? Is that how you imagine yourself? Word imagination, right? Because it takes imagination to sort of envision this kind of reality. Right? How do you set up the classroom? How do you set up your teaching? What do people do? How does that look? It looks different if you have a teacher-centered model and the expertise and rigor and content of the teacher drives everything. If it's student-centered, right, that's a different model. Right? If it's subject-centered, there's implications for the way that would look too. Right? Bringing, in a sense, the both of those worlds together. Right? So there's some practical choices. In the subject-centered classroom, the teacher's central task is to give the great thing an independent voice, a capacity to speak its truth quite apart from the teacher's voice in terms that students can hear and understand. Okay, so that's sort of Quaker speak, if I can call it that, with all due respect to the great man. If you turn that into a more kind of orthodox or evangelical construct, you're actually allowing the scriptures to speak to you. And part of the problem with this sort of teacher-dominant model is that ultimately it's the domination of the teacher over the text that doesn't necessarily allow that text to speak, right? It's the idea of opening up the text and allowing the text to speak. So biblical interpretation and teaching, preaching at its best is allowing that voice to speak and allowing it to speak at its own authentic voice from its own time to us, right? It's not imposing something upon, but it's allowing it actually to speak to us, right? So his subject matter, he wants that to happen, right? He wants us to learn from the central thing that is at the center, right? Just as much as we interrogate it does interrogate us. And he'd say the same thing is true whether you're talking about scripture, whether you're taking discipleship at that center thing, whether you take something, some sort of training module from your company, right? How is that actually interrogating you as much as you're interrogating it, right? So in this interesting idea of the community of truth that he's talking about, the subject itself has a kind of life. It has a sort of vitality. It's not inert. It's actually alive. You're gathered around it, right? So that you will actually interact with it with you, right? That's what he's talking about. It's very interesting. Very and sort of provocative idea, but I think it's got some real merit. It's giving great respect to this thing that you're studying, and while you're studying it, it actually has its ability to confront and to change you. Right? So behind this is a lot of philosophical thinking that he's done about how you know. And it's a critique of this sort of Western model of knowledge, which is a domination over. That's where this is all coming from, right? So, and he's trying to get out of that trap, right? And education follows our understandings of how we know, right? Epistemology, to use the big word, right? And so if you have this very objectivist kind of epistemology, where in a sense the object is an inert butterfly that you have stuck pins into, and it's sitting there before you dead, right? You have a kind of mastery over it. But if that thing is alive and well, and it speaks and it has a voice, right? Then the way that you know it is in relationship, right? And not by sticking a pin in it. This thing is alive, and you interact with it, and it will speak to you, right? This is where he's coming from. It's very interesting.